but I want to welcome you all. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here live, and thank you for being here virtually. Thank you for joining us at the Rutgers Law School event today, Anti-Semitism and the Palestinian Genocide, featuring Dr. Raz Segal, a distinguished professor in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. Before we begin that conversation, I'd like to introduce the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, or CSRR, as we say, the organizer of today's event. And I'm happy to say that I've been a member of the board of CSRR since perhaps its inception, Sahar, for a long time. CSRR is committed to examining the intersections of race, religion, and national security, especially as they impact the Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. Our work focuses on three main themes: the intersection of race and religion in the United States, examining how these dynamics shape discrimination and policy, the criminalization of Muslim identity, analyzing how the US and global national security laws impact Muslim communities worldwide. And the third theme is transnational rights and security, which explores the effects of US relations with Muslim majority countries on security, rights, and public perceptions. So through research, through public education and advocacy, CSRR promotes pluralism, religious freedom, and racial equality. Today's event, which examines anti-Semitism and the Palestinian genocide, speaks directly to that mission. We are honored to host Dr. Raz Segal, whose work in the Holocaust and Genocide Studies offers insights into systematic violence. Conversations like today's are vital for fostering awareness, empathy, and justice across communities. If you'd like to stay in touch with us at CSRR, follow us on Instagram at Rutgers CSRR, and check out our Race and Rights podcast for more in-depth discussions with scholars, activists, and community leaders. Again, I thank you for being here today, live or online, and please join me in welcoming our director at the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, Professor Sahar Aziz. She'll be introducing our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Aftab. And we're so grateful for Professor Aftab's contribution as a board member on the Board of Advisory of the Center for Security, Race, and Rights. It's truly an honor today to have such a brilliant academic and a courageous academic during a very difficult and challenging historical time. Dr. Raz Segal, thank you so much for joining us. Dr. Raz Segal is an associate professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies, endowed professor in the study of modern genocide at Stockton University. Dr. Segal has held a Harry Frank Guggenheim Fellowship, a Fulbright Fellowship, and he was recently a senior fellow at the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute for Holocaust Studies. His publications, which I highly recommend, include Genocide in the Carpathians, War, Social Breakdown, and Mass Violence from 1914 to 1945, published by Stanford University Press. And he served as guest editor of the Hebrew language special issue on genocide, mass violence, and cultural erasure of Zamanu, Historical Quarterly. He is at work on a book on the distortion, weaponization, and mobilization of Holocaust history and the reproduction of white supremacy and state violence, including a focus on Israel's assault on Palestinians from the 1948 Nakba to the current genocidal assault on Gaza. He's also published in multiple mainstream media in English, Hebrew, and German in The Guardian, The LA Times, The Nation, Jewish Currents, 972 Magazine, Time Magazine, Forward, and he has appeared on Counterpoints, MSNBC, Al Jazeera English, Democracy Now!, and ABC News. So we are truly, truly honored and thankful for having you here today, Dr. Segal. So I thought what we would start is first by having you give us kind of a introductory set of remarks about the topic that we're discussing today, which is anti-Semitism and Palestinian genocide. two topics that people don't talk about together, and two topics that are equally important. So let's just get started with the big picture of how can we understand, or can you explain how you understand and how we should understand what anti-Semitism is and its evolution over time? And I guess related to that is the flip, is what is not anti-Semitism and why not, based on your expertise?
Well, so well, thank you so much for the invitation. Conversation. Thank you for everyone who took part, organizing this, your records, including your law students. And thank you for everyone who came this evening, and online, of course. So, yeah, anti-Semitism and Israel's genocidal assault in Gaza. I think that it's important to understand this for two reasons. One, obviously, we're facing a weaponization of the struggle against anti-Semitism in the context of the struggle to stop Israel's genocidal attack against Gaza, on Gaza, and in the struggle for accountability, the struggle for truth and justice. So this weaponization is one reason to understand anti-Semitism in the context of thinking about Israel's attack on Gaza. The other reason is that when we look at the history of anti-Semitism, we see that it has been reproduced in a very tragic way, actually, in the establishment of the state of Israel. So what do I mean by that? In order to understand that, we need a bit of a history of what is this phenomenon of modern anti-Semitism. When I say modern anti-Semitism, I'm talking about a phenomenon that is different than earlier ideas, actions, violence against Jews in periods before the modern period. And the modern phenomenon is very specific because it's tied to two key issues in the modern world. One is colonialism, and the other is nationalism and the nation state. And we can't really understand anti-Semitism as a modern phenomenon without these two issues. In terms of colonialism and European empire building projects around the world, and that includes settler colonialism, of course. This is where we see the emergence of the concept of race thinking, and racism, and the modern phenomenon of anti-Semitism is, of course, very much tied to race thinking. So thinking about Jews as a race, that's a new phenomenon in the modern and specifically late modern world from the 19th century onwards, right? That is clearly different than thinking about Jews in earlier periods. Now, it's important to say that, of course, ideas about modern and late modern ideas about Jews are connected in various ways to earlier ideas about Jews, but there's also significant things that are new that we have to understand. So race and race thinking and racism is very important in the story. And colonialism and empire, European empire buildings also takes ideas about Jews, right, and puts them on a truly global scale, right, which is also something very new in the late modern world, because now ideas about Jews can start to function in relation to the key economic system of European imperialism, that is capitalism, right? So ideas about Jewish power, about that Jews are trying to take over the world, that they're everywhere, that they control banks, that they control the economic system. But then also we actually have the flip side of that, because Jews, for example, Arab-speaking Jews in North Africa, under, say, French and Italian colonial rule, can also be now perceived in the frame of colonialism as primitive people, right, tied to people under colonial imperialism, right? So we have also these contradictions that are tied to the global scale of anti-Semitism in the colonial and imperial world. I'll say here that these contradictions actually are dissolved when they're reproduced in the state of Israel. We'll get to that in a minute. Right? The second, so we have colonialism, imperialism. The second issue is the nation state and nationalism, right? So the rise of the nation state, and specifically after World War I, when the empires within Europe collapse and we have the emergence of the nation state system. So it's immediately emerges as an exclusionary nation state system, where anyone in any state, any nation state who is not part of the hegemonic group, right? Hungarians in Hungary, Poles in Poland, Germans in Germany, and so on and so on. And all this is defined, of course, in national terms. This new, right, collective identity of nationalism, right? So, of course, Jews are inherently excluded, specifically when the ideas about them are about race as well, right? So we have these two systems that really are intersect in the late modern period, from the late 19th century onwards, and create a new phenomenon, right? Anti-Semitism, and indeed the term emerges, of course, in the German Empire in the late 19th century, and it's important to say that it emerges among people who call themselves anti-Semites, right? They invent the term in order to call themselves anti-Semites. Probably they have a very clear agenda that is to reverse Jewish emancipation. So this exclusionary idea. So this is anti-Semitism, right? As a modern phenomenon, really on one leg, right? Now, it's important to say that the essence of the struggle against anti-Semitism that emerges also in the late 19th century with the rise of anti-Semitism is to protect a group, okay, a people, under attack, discriminated, persecuted, excluded, right, by states, okay? Now, what happens, so this, what we all see today in front of our eyes, right? And this is well before October 7th, 2023, right? This weaponization of the weaponization of the struggle against anti-Semitism. In many cases, we hear about the weaponization of anti-Semitism. It's actually the weaponization of the struggle against anti-Semitism. And this has been going on for a long time, actually. It emerges in the 1990s. We can get to that in a minute. Actually, as an Israeli state project, right? And the essence of the weaponization is to turn the struggle on its head, actually. Not now to protect a group persecuted by states, right, and excluded by states, or people who see themselves as acting on behalf of states, right? Rather, the goal now is actually to protect the state defined as a Jewish state, right, which is itself, of course, an ethno-national, racist, exclusionary understanding of the state, right? So to protect the state from any criticism, right? Especially criticism that's related, of course, to its discrimination and persecution and exclusion and attack and violence against a group, Palestinians, right? So it takes the struggle and it's really a pure weaponization of the struggle. And of course, it's important to say that once we are engaged in this weaponization, right? And again, this is well before October 7th, right? Then we also shift the focus away actually from anti-Semitism, and there is no shortage of very real anti-Semitism in the world today, right? But we shift the focus away from that, right? And now onto a state, right? One of the things that this does, of course, is that it puts Jews in more danger in various ways. It shifts the focus away from the struggle against anti-Semitism, but because we're now focusing on the exclusionary nature of the definition of the state, the Jewish state, right, it also enhances this idea that all Jews, right, are identified with a foreign state, even if they're Americans or Germans or French or wherever they are, right? Now they are seen, because this is part of the project of the weaponization of the struggle against anti-Semitism, they are seen effectively as Zionists, as Israelis, right? So this actually enhances this idea, for example, of double loyalty, right? The Jews are not loyal, right? The Jews are a danger, the Jews are a threat, right? The Jews are the enemy within, so on and so forth. All this happens, right? So this puts, of course, the weaponization is aimed to target Palestinians and Arabs and anyone who is in solidarity in the struggle for Palestinian liberation, right? But it also puts Jews it increases the danger which Jews find themselves in around the world, right? So this is again in a nutshell, right? If we think about anti-Semitism and the weaponization of anti-Semitism, right? So to answer your question, critiquing a state, right, is not anti-Semitism, right? Absolutely not. It could be uncomfortable for some people. It could be a point of political debate and so on and so forth, right? And not everyone agrees. Fine. That's what happens when we critique any state, right? I mean, no one, if I critique the Russian invasion of Ukraine, right? If I critique the political ideology that drives the Russian invasion of Ukraine, right? No one would assume that I'm expressing racism against all Russians, right? Actually, no one would assume that in relation to critique of any state around the world. This is very important, right? The idea that this Israeli idea that Israel is singled out, right, for criticism. Only Israel is singled out for criticism, right? It's actually exactly the other way around. Only Israel is singled out that you cannot criticize Israel. Right? That's what this weaponization does. Again, this is very much in a nutshell, but this is the anti-Semitism and its weaponization. I'll just say one more thing about this. As I said, when we think about the, first of all, when we think about, so when we think about anti-Semitism as a modern phenomena, colonialism and the nation state system, and we think about the establishment of Israel in 1948, right, and through the 1948 Nakba, then we see that Israel actually emerged exactly at the intersection of these two modern phenomena. It emerges explicitly as a Jewish nation state, right? And for anyone who's in doubt, it took a long time, but for anyone who's in doubt, in 2018, the state itself, right, enacted a new basic law. Israel doesn't have a constitution. It has a set of basic laws instead. That's a different talk, right? But one of its new basic laws in 2018 is the Jewish nation state basic law, right? Which is an explicitly exclusionary, racist law, actually framed in settler terms also, right? Which also then brings us to the other phenomena, right, of Israel established immediately as a settler state, right? And it's important to say, by the way, that if you don't want to, don't take the words, right, of people who critique Zionism in Israel. Take the word of Israelis and Zionists about what the Zionist project and what Israel is. That is a settler colonial project. We can think of one of the most well-known examples is, of course, Zev Jabotinsky's The Iron Wall essay from 1923, right? A very well-known essay. You can find it online on the Jabotinsky Institute website, translated to English. It's a text about an internal debate between Zionists, between Jabotinsky, who's the founder of revisionist Zionism, that is right-wing Zionism, and what he perceived at the time as left-wing Zionists. And he asks them, right? He says, look, Zionism is colonialism. That's his premise. He said, do you know of any indigenous people around the world who have accepted the colonizer? It's a rhetorical question, of course. The answer is no, right? So he says, either Zionism stops, right? Or it proceeds regardless of the Palestinian Arabs, the indigenous people of the land. And that's how he calls them in the essay, right? So clearly there's many other ways, the post-1967 settler movement in Israel, right? In Israel society, the people who went to live in the occupied territories after 67 are called literally settlers in Hebrew, mitnachlim. Okay, there are other words that you could have used in Hebrew for that, but they're called mitachlim because that's the project, right? It's a settler project, right? If we look at what's happening now, of course, Israel's attack on Gaza, of course, right? We see explicit Israeli leaders, right, participate in public events and conferences to express, right, their settler agenda about Gaza, right? So there's no doubt about it. Now, if we think that Israel is indeed at the intersection of the national project and the settler project, right, then tragically it has reproduced, right, the modern phenomena that actually were at the core of excluding Jews, persecuting Jews, discriminating Jews, eventually targeting Jews for destruction by the Nazis and other fascist and authoritarian nationalists in Europe, right? After the Nazis and after the war, rather than come to terms with that, right? This was reproduced globally, nationalism and colonialism, right? But it was reproduced specifically, right, in the Israeli nation settler state project, right? There's much more to say about this, but
Right, right. So I have one follow-up question because I can anticipate this being a critique or a follow-up from a critic is, what about before the nation state? We do hear often discussions about pogroms that have gone back centuries, and that particularly in Eastern Europe, did this all exist just during the nation state, or what is the connection between the post-nation state context and the pre-nation state context with regard to anti-Semitism? Whether it's is it different in nature, or is it different in degree, or just so that we understand that narrative, because we do hear it quite a bit.
I mean, there's no doubt that Jews were singled out for persecution and violence and exclusion before the modern period as well. Absolutely. Is there a difference? As I said now, absolutely. Absolutely, there is a difference. I think that the key question, right, there's a kind of a bread and butter historical question. For example, when we think about the Holocaust, okay, I'm a historian of the Jewish world, and I'm a historian of the Holocaust as well. When we think about the Holocaust, there's a bread and butter historical question in the sense of why did it happen, where it happened, when it happened, right? So why did the Holocaust happen in the heart of Europe, right, in the middle of the 20th century? It happened because we have this new modern phenomenon, race thinking, the colonial world, European empire building, and the nation state, right? This is phenomena that is new, right? This is not to minimize at all, say, religious anti-Semitism from earlier periods. This is not meant to minimize, right, the experiences of Jews and other groups, right, who suffered discrimination and exclusion and persecution earlier, right? It's meant to say that we have a different, right, phenomena, a different set of circumstances, different processes and political structures, right? That is the reason that we see also a different kind of violence, right? The Holocaust, and in general, the phenomena of modern genocide is aimed to destroy groups as such, right, as a whole, right, is very much tied, right, to the modern world. Of course, also to Jews in the modern world, very.
And that brings me to another question that I have, that bringing that now to the United States context before October 7th, 2023. Let's just look at least for the last 100 years, or at least since 1948, is how has this weaponization of anti-Semitism operated in the United States, and what's its relationship to race thinking? Because I'm a critical race scholar, and I focus primarily on the domestic context. And what I have always found a bit troubling or jarring is the desire to treat Jews as a separate race by Jews, by especially pro-Israeli or Zionist Jews. And I think, is that really what you want? I mean, putting aside the fact that race is a social construction, and sometimes it's for utilitarian purposes because of Title VI, which protects individuals based on race, color, and national origin, and doesn't include religion in terms of anti-discrimination protections in any programs that receive federal funding. So we're seeing that at play at universities. But putting aside kind of the legal utilitarian arguments, you just explained how race thinking is what produced anti-Semitism, but we're also seeing race thinking in the weaponization of anti-Semitism in the United States. So could you explain to us kind of that phenomena, as well as how do you see the weaponization of anti-Semitism in the US?
I mean, I would actually focus at the core of the weaponization is the national identity. Now, the national identity, the Jewish national identity, is also tied, of course, to race thinking. That's of course, because modern national identities are very much tied to race thinking. And we can think, for example, again, if we think about the Jewish settler nation state, right? And we can think about settler colonialism, white supremacy, right? Then in the Israeli case, of course, what we see is a Jewish supremacy, right? This white supremacy manifests itself as Jewish supremacy. Now, this is, as I mentioned before, the contradictions about anti-Semitism in the modern world, where Jews could be both all-powerful, for example, and say agents, serve in, say, German colonial administrations in Africa, right? As Germans, because that's how, of course, Jews in Germany saw themselves, right? As Germans, right? But they can also then be, so they can these, devious, all-powerful people trying to take over the world, but they can also be these, primitive people in race terms, right? Under colonial, occupation. These contradictions dissolve, right, in the Israeli state project as a settler nation state, because now Jews assume the ultimate manifestation, really, of supremacy, that is state power, right? That's Jewish supremacy in the Israeli case. So the national identity is tied, of course, to race thinking, but the key to thinking about the weaponization is really to forefront a national identity that is specifically Zionism, right? The weaponization is really, and I think that when we think about, again, as I said, the weaponization targets Palestinians, it targets other Arabs, anyone who's in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle for liberation, for truth and justice. But now what we're seeing, and when we think about the US context, right, what we're seeing in the last 13 months on university campuses is that a lot of Jews, right, are targeted in this weaponization campaign. And specifically, of course, anti-Zionist Jews are identified, right, as anti-Zionist Jews. And this really highlights for us the issue of the national identity, right? So what the Israeli state does, right, is that it basically creates a situation, right? And again, from the 90s, as I said, this becomes actually an Israeli project, this weaponization of the struggle against anti-Semitism, that the only way to really be a Jew now, right, is to be a Zionist, right, and to identify with Israel, right? Now, I have to say there's very interesting background. So the question of who is a Jew, right, and who defines who is, because this is part of the question, right, of course, has a history in the Jewish world, right? And it's, I'll just say that it's very interesting that, this idea of Jews deciding for other Jews that they're not Jews, right, for example, or they're not good Jews, right, for instance, has a history when we think about the rise of Zionism, right, then Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox rabbis in Central and Eastern Europe, they actually attacked Zionists, right, as bad Jews, as not Jews at all, actually, because of course it was part of a struggle where Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox rabbis and communities were fearful that Zionists would, take away their members, right? Of course, it was also a religious, a secular conflict. So there's like this interesting history to this, right? Because now, of course, what we're seeing is Zionists, right, are now in the position of saying, well, the only way to be a Jew, or the only way to be a good Jew, right, is to be a Zionist, right? Now, we're seeing this, again, the national issue is very important in the weaponization campaign, because it's meant to now, the struggle against anti-Semitism is to protect the state rather than a people, right? So there's that, but one of the things that we're seeing now is that anti-Zionist Jews, and this is really very scary, right? Anti-Zionist Jews are themselves tagged as anti-Semites, right? So it's not just that you're not a Jew. And again, also self-hating Jews, of course, there's a history to that, right, in the Jewish world, right? But now we see this really as this kind of growing phenomena, right, and discourse where anti-Zionist Jews, right, because of their critique of Israel, are now tagged as anti-Semites. Now, this is very important to stress here that anti-Zionism, of course, emerges in the Jewish world with Zionism, right? Well before the establishment of Israel, right? And in that sense, if we think about Zionism as also a form of Jewish identity, right? Then anti-Zionism also emerges as a form of Jewish identity, right? Now, and today as well, right? So now to come and to say, and this is of course when we think about the weaponization, we are talking about an Israeli state project, but also now an American state project, basically, right? So now for the state, not just other Jews, but for the state to come in and say, if you express your Jewish identity in this way, that is as an anti-Zionist Jew, right? You are an anti-Semite. What this really is, this weaponization is really anti-Semitic because it attacks Jews for the way that they identify themselves as Jews, right? You're with me? This is a bit. And this is where we are. This is the level of absurdity, right? That is blowing up in our face today now. And I think it's important, of course, to say that one of the spheres in which we see this, of course, is campuses and universities and colleges. We're one right now, right? And this is particularly tragic and very scary because, of course, universities are supposed to be places that are committed to documented reality, right? That are committed to research, that are committed to truth, right? We're not supposed to be at a university, and I would look out the window right now and say it's dark outside, but the university and the state would come and say, no, it's the middle of the day, right? This is how it feels like, right? This is how it feels. This is how this weaponization really is, right? We are told that it's the middle of the day outside, right? So this is where we are. This is the essence of this is how it also now, you can ask, why is it so important, of course, for the US state and for US universities, right, to engage in this weaponization campaign as well, right? So of course, Israel's attack on Gaza, but when we think about Israeli settler colonialism and decades of Israeli settler colonial violence and crimes against Palestinians, right? With impunity, we can come back to this point about impunity, right? Then, of course, all this, we have incredible US support in the background all the time. So this is not, the US support is not a new phenomenon, right? But since the 7th of October, 2023, and the Hamas attack on Israel and then subsequent Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza, we have US support, right, that as time goes on, right, is in the face of the largest mass protest movement in the US since the Vietnam War, right? So much, of course, the level, the extreme violence, genocide, again, we can talk about the question of genocide, but genocide that we all see in front of our eyes and on our screen now for more than a year, right? We see the killing of aid workers by Israel, the killing of US citizens by Israel, the resistance to all of this by a lot of Jews, for example, the angry resignation of officials in the State Department, in the United Nations, some of them Jews as well, right? So we see, US support, right? And of course, the numerous red lines, quote unquote, that the Biden administration has, itself set for Israel, right? Don't invade Gaza, don't invade Rafah, which Israel again and again has crossed, right? Explicitly, spitting in the face of the US government only to receive more money, more weapons, more ammunition, more bombs, right? Why? Right? So yes, we can, Israel as a proxy for US interest in the Middle East, right? International arms deals, right, which are very profitable for a very small number of people, right? But of course, they also happen to be some of these people connected to governments in various ways, right? There's all of that, but there's a deeper issue, right? In my view, at least, that is difficult without it to explain why we see this, US support for Israel and then the weaponization of the struggle against anti-Semitism, which is itself anti-Semitic and of course a crude violation of First Amendment, right? It's also a crude violation of just US law. Of course, US support for Israel is also a crude violation of US law because it's used to perpetrate mass atrocities and genocide, right? But why? Of course, if we have to come to terms with what Israeli leaders are telling us that they're doing in Gaza themselves, again, right, which is meant to take Israeli settler colonialism to its horrific conclusion, right, to create a greater Israel, that is, with as many Jews as possible and as little Palestinians as possible, right? If we have to come to terms with that, right, then the settler colonial genie is out of the bottle, right? And then we have to deal with it everywhere, including here, right? And US settler colonialism, this is a settler colonial state built on genocide and dispossession, which continues actually, and which is blurred and denied and rationalized in various ways. Who wants to deal with that? So the weaponization, and so I'll just say one more thing about this. Why does the weaponization of the struggle against anti-Semitism, as I said, emerge in the 90s? As an Israeli state project, that's when it emerges, right? Why in the 90s? What happens in the 90s? Well, what happens in the 90s is that the discourse about Israeli settler colonialism and Zionism as a settler colonial project really emerges very significantly in the 90s by scholars who are not Palestinians, because Palestinians, of course, have been talking about this since the 50s, since the beginning of the Israeli state project, right? But in the 90s, suddenly others are starting to write about this and talk about this. And then there's also a rise in the discourse about settler colonialism in the US and in Canada, in Australia. Indigenous scholars are starting to write about this. So all kinds of connections are made, right? Big problem, right? How do we make sure that if you say that Israel is a settler colonial project, but we don't talk about this, right? It's anti-Semitism. That's when the project emerges, right? And it intensifies also in the frame tragically of Holocaust memory, right? Because part of the lessons of the Holocaust in that sense, right? I say lessons and I, quotation marks in the air because I just don't like this formulation, lessons of the Holocaust. But if we want to use it, right, then of course it's a struggle against anti-Semitism, right? This struggle, so the weaponization also happens within the frame of what we call global Holocaust memory that emerges in the 90s after the fall of the Soviet Union and the communist bloc, and it really, reaches a very, high level of where the state really, also the US state, institutionalizes this weaponization with the definition of anti-Semitism by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IHRA, in 2016, that is now used as a key tool of this weaponization, also in universities in the US, in Europe, and we can talk a bit more about this, but.
Yeah, no, this is a great transition because, so after October 7th, obviously, all of the grievances of Palestinians and everything that you've discussed in terms of settler colonial experiences and all sorts of violations of international law by the state of Israel they predated October 7th. However, after October 7th, the record and the facts on the ground, I would argue, changed exponentially to be much more severe, and not to erase or dismiss before October 7th, and not also to dismiss the violence and the war crimes against civilians in Israel, right? So this is not a zero-sum game. But I just want to cite a few facts and then ask you as a genocide scholar, why this has been such a contentious issue to call it a genocide, and I guess more specifically why you have gone public quite a while back stating that this is either a genocide or it is about to be a genocide and now perhaps has become one. So just a few facts. So I think we all know, because mainstream media doesn't hide the fact that it centers the experiences of the Israeli state and the Israeli citizens. And so we know that on October 7th, 2023, Hamas committed attacks that were war crimes against civilians in terms of killing, I believe, 850 civilians and then kidnapping as hostages over 200 civilians. We can argue and have a debate under international law whether the killing of the combatants are war crimes, because then we're in the law of war. But I will state my position that I support the laws protecting civilians in conflict. Nevertheless, or since then, we're now in 13 months, we have over 44,000 Palestinians reported dead, with 10,000 to 15,000 presumed dead because they're under the rubble, and we don't know if people will ever find them. And so we're talking now around possibly 60,000 people dead. There's tens of thousands, some argue hundreds of thousands in the next 3 to 5 years that are going to die. This is the Lancet, the medical journal in the UK, as a result of the lack of medical care, lack of food, lack of medicine, and all of that is manufactured because of the destruction of Gaza. 17,000 children reported dead. Some of them, again, it can go up to 25,000 if you're with the unaccounted for, those buried. We have 165 doctors have been killed by Israel. 260 nurses have been killed by the Israeli military. Over 180 journalists have been killed. I mean, the numbers are devastating. You have polio has returned, all sorts of scabies, chickenpox, skin rashes, diarrhea, acute respiratory infections is just spreading like wildfire, because 17 out of the 36 hospitals have been completely destroyed. The remaining 19 are barely functional, and there has been very intentional mass starvation. And again, the data is all out there. Unfortunately, the media does not report it. So this allegation that Israel is committing genocide has caused Congress to hold hearings, to McCarthyistic hearings, to attack academics, myself included, to try to shut down the Center for Security, Race, and Rights. I have no doubt you've been attacked very aggressively, and even though you are Jewish, an Israeli American, and a genocide and Holocaust scholar, of course, bringing back the absurdity of the reality we live in. So just even having the discussion and looking at the facts and stating, this looks like genocide, right? But even saying that brings in the harsh, the hammer of Congress and also of university administrators. So in your expert opinion, what is the crime of genocide? What distinguishes war from genocide? And why do you conclude that what Israel is doing in Gaza is genocide?
So, I think maybe before we go to the key argument about why Israel's attack on Gaza fits the definition of genocide in international law, and it's important to say that there's only one way, really, in which we can have this discussion, that is according to the definition of the crime of genocide in international law in Article 2 of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide in the United Nations of December 1948. And therefore, any discussion that is not related to the definition of the crime in the convention is really irrelevant in that sense, right? If someone feels that it doesn't look like the Holocaust, for example, right? Not relevant. I mean, right? That's not what we're talking about. Whether it looks like the Holocaust or doesn't look like the Holocaust, or does it fit the definition of the crime in international law, or doesn't it? Right? We'll get to that in a second, but I think that it's important to understand. First of all, as a scholar of the Jewish world and a scholar of the Holocaust and genocide, right? One of the things in my field, Holocaust and genocide studies, right? Which is also, of course, an intense crisis in the last 13 months. But one of the things that the rationals, if you will, of the field, right? This is a very unique field, by the way. There is no other field, right? When you think about Holocaust studies, right, that's framed around what's perceived as an event, right? But the rationale of the field in that sense, right, is that, you know, it's important to study this. It's important to have this field, right? Holocaust studies and then Holocaust and genocide studies, because we need to be able to detect, right, you know, various things that are supposed to turn on our red lights, right, in certain circumstances, because we need to be, you know, on guard, never again, right? So when in the 13th of October, I published this piece in Jewish Currents, where I argued not the risk of genocide, but I argued already that we are seeing actually genocide unfold, and I'll get to that, right? That was because that it's clear that if there are red lights that come up, right, in certain circumstances, right, then it's supposed to be a responsibility, right, of people in the field, right, to say why, because then we can, you know, stop it early, right? This was 13 months ago, right? So it's important to say that this idea of, well, you know, it's very, you know, we shouldn't use this word lightly, right? Genocide, right? We should be very careful with it, but when there are clear indications that what we're seeing is unfolding genocide, or at the very least, right, a significant risk of genocide, then we should definitely use the word genocide. That's the whole rationale of the field, right? So that now another comment before we get to the crime itself, which is important to understand, is why is it so difficult? So of course, you know, Israel, the vast majority of Israel's actually people who support Israel. For them, it's, you know, it's impossible to imagine and to think and to say that Israel is perpetrating genocide, right? You can't say that. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that, right? You can't accuse Israel of genocide. That's an impossibility, basically. So before we get to the crime, it's important to address this. And why is it important? Because actually, the crime of genocide, when it emerges in 1948 in the United Nations, the immediate background is the Holocaust. And it's the Holocaust, when no one used the word at the time, of course, right? But what we now call the Holocaust, right? The Nazi genocide of Jews. And it was immediately perceived as unique, as exceptional, right? As whatever word you want to use, right? And why was it important? In order actually to disconnect it, right? To disconnect it from colonial genocides, right? To maintain the idea that the modern period is a mere period of progress, right? Nazism an accident, the Holocaust is an accident, right? It's unique, right? This idea that it's unique. If the Holocaust is unique, Israel, the state where indeed a lot of Holocaust survivors try to build their lives, right? The state of the survivors in that formulation, right? The state that's perceived as the, you know, response to the Holocaust, right, is also unique. Now, of course, the idea is that it's really a uniqueness about three things: the Holocaust, Israel, but Jews, right? So this ties into the idea that Jews are a special people as well, right? Why is all this very important? Because if Israel is unique, right, and it's unique in relation to the Holocaust that frames the new crime of genocide, right, then it's in the international political and legal system that emerges after World War II, it indeed becomes unimaginable, unspeakable that Israel, the unique Jewish state of the survivors of the Holocaust, could ever perpetrate really any crime under international law, but not to mention genocide. And that means also that Nakba denial, right, the denial of the foundational crime of the Israeli state, the expulsion of 750,000 Palestinians from their home, the destruction of more than 400 villages and towns of Palestinians during the 1948 war, right? The denial of the Nakba becomes actually structural structural in the emergence of the international legal system after World War II in relation to the crime of genocide, because there's a need to deny it immediately in order to maintain this idea that Israel is unique and it's impossible that it could perpetrate any crime under international law, again, let alone genocide. This is where we see impunity for Israel emerge from the very beginning, right? That's why we see, I mean, think about it. Let's even put aside all the violence, the violent crimes in international law. The settlement project after 1967, right? Nearly 1 million Jews in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem, which is a crude violation of international law. It's a war crime, right? You are not allowed to transfer, occupying power to transfer its citizens into occupied land. That's black and white. It doesn't require any interpretation, right? Decades of impunity, right? We have nearly 1 million Jewish settlers in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem today, right? Why? Because of this, okay? So it's important to understand when we now think about the crime of genocide, right? The denial that Israel is perpetrating genocide, the denial is that Israel is perpetrating any crime under international law, right? But of course, genocide is rooted in this framework, right? That the Holocaust is unique, Jews are unique, Israel is unique, right? The crime of genocide. So look, in the crime of genocide, it's important to say, there is no hierarchy in international law between crimes, right? We imagine a hierarchy, right? Because genocide is perceived as a crime of crime. Right? But there is no hierarchy in international law between different crimes. And of course, for the victims of different sorts of violence and crimes in international law, it doesn't matter at all what the crime, how it's defined in international law, right? There are specific elements, right, that differentiate different crimes under international law. In genocide, one of the specific elements that we have, right, is the issue of intent, right? According to the convention, intent to destroy a group as such, okay, that is because of membership in the group, not for any other reason, right? And of course, as we know, intent is incredibly difficult to prove, right? That's why we have very, 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 very few cases that are established as genocide after World War II, right? You can think about the Rwanda genocide, Srebrenica in 1995, right? There are very few cases that are accepted as genocide, right? Because of the issue of intent. Intent is very difficult to prove, and intent is very difficult to prove because perpetrators, right, of genocide don't go around, right, declaring their intent usually, right? Why do we see such explicit, outright, clear, proud declarations of intent in the Israeli case from the 7th of October? By the way, until today, they're ongoing, right? And I'm talking about what people that are called in international law, people with command authority, right? Because Israeli politics and media and society since the 7th of October are just filled with genocidal rhetoric, by the way, right? Filled with celebrations of mass killings, okay? Anyone who follows the Hebrew language media and social media, right? And this is from the very beginning. You know, in the first days after October 7th, there were these posters that were hung from the bridges on the freeway of Tel Aviv, the Ayalon freeway, and they had things written on them like, for example, the picture of victory in Gaza equals 0 people, right? So the public sphere is filled with these things, right? Immediately after 7th of October and until today. But people with command authority, that is state leaders, senior army officers, war cabinet ministers, right? We have dozens and dozens, right, of their intent to destroy since the 7th of October, right? Declaring it clearly, right, that, for example, I mean, things that, again, one of the things that are incredible in this case is that it's all out there, right? We've all seen and heard this, right? Again and again and again, right? But then it's this kind of, it's blurred. It's very difficult to prove intent. So let's address this for a minute, this issue of intent, right? For example, what are so intent is expressed, first of all, with clear, dehumanizing language. This is, by the way, one of the red lights that we teach in Holocaust and genocide studies, our students, right? When we see dehumanization, because Jews faced so much dehumanization, right, by the Nazis and by other fascists and authoritarians and nationalists during before and during World War II, and also after, right? Dehumanization is supposed to turn on the red lights. So much dehumanization of Palestinians, right? Of course, this is a history well before 7th of October, but so much dehumanization after 7th of October, right? Infamously, Israel's war minister, former war minister, Yoav Gallant, right? And I think we should use war minister, by the way, not defense minister, right? On 9th of October, when he declared the total siege on Gaza, right? Called Palestinians human animals, right? The next day, by the way, some people said, well, maybe he's only referring to Hamas militants, right? As if that's okay. But the next day, on 10th of October, General Hassan Alian, who is at the head of the organization the army organization that deals with the occupied territories, recorded a message directly to the people of Gaza, right? And in order that will all be clear, called all of them human animals, right? Which also, by the way, demonstrates, right? Gallant on the 9th of October, not clear, only Hamas militants or all of Palestinians in Gaza. 10th of October, Hassan Alian makes it clear, it's all the people of Gaza. So we have this slip, by the way, in Israeli political discourse by using terms that refer maybe only to militants, but probably more. And then people clarify that it's really aimed at everyone in Gaza, right? So dehumanization. We also have the use of religious language, right? Amalek, the biblical story of Amalek. Again, the biblical story of Amalek is very clear, right? It's a biblical story of the Israelites commanded to destroy a group, Amalek's perceived as enemies, right? As an existential threat to the Israelites as a whole. They're supposed to destroy the entire group, right? So these expressions of intent that use different mechanisms by different people in different times. Sometimes it's very explicit, like the Israeli president, right? A few days after 7th of October, it's Yitzhak Herzog saying it's the entire nation out there in Gaza, right? That are responsible for the Hamas attack on Israel, right? So making it very clear. Now, it's important to say that in international law, we need a connection between intent and the violence on the ground. Right? This is usually where the complexity comes in. Okay, we have, well, did they really mean it, right? But do we see, does this really drive the violence? Does this really drive what's happening on the ground? And in many cases, by the way, because we have thousands of videos of officers and soldiers on the ground, filming themselves perpetrating war crimes and violence and proudly uploading them to social media, we can see in many cases, by the way, that they are mirroring in the language that they use in these videos, expressions of intent to destroy by the political leadership in those same days, right? So for example, right, Netanyahu talks about, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu talks about a war of the people of light against the people of darkness, right? Religious genocidal language, right? Soldiers, and even mentions specific places, say the Sajaiya neighborhood. In those same days, within days, we see soldiers filming themselves in Sajaiya, talking about the war of the people of light against the people of darkness, right? Mirroring. So we actually see these kinds of direct links. But let's just even think about Gallant's total siege policies, right? Total siege means that all the 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza, everyone, right, are now under total siege. As Gallant said, no food, no clean water, no medicine, no fuel, not everyone, not just militants, right? This is indeed targeting a group as a whole, as such, right? Of course, added all the other rhetoric of all Palestinians are responsible for this. All Palestinians are Amalek. We can also think about the weaponization of the struggle against anti-Semitism, the weaponization of the Holocaust, all Palestinians are Nazis, right? Another dehumanizing mechanism, right? If we think about total siege, what has Israel done since the 9th of October, since the total siege explicit proclamation until today? Exactly that. It has created starvation policies. It has created famine. It has created a situation where even if we take the official UN estimates of over 44,000 people killed, that Israel has killed in its attack so far, then we know, according to the Lancet article, right, that hundreds of thousands of Palestinians will, if Israel's attack stops now, right, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians will die, right, in the coming months and years because of the conditions that Israel has intentionally created in the total siege policies. So I'll just say about this, and this is very important because the convention intend to destroy, then there are 5 forms of violence, right? Killing members of the group, causing serious bodily and mental harm. Then there's the 3rd form, which is creating conditions calculated to bring about the physical destruction of the group in whole or in part. This is the total siege policies, okay? It's also important to mention, by the way, that this 3rd form of violence, we also have then preventing birth within the group and forcibly transferring children from one group to another. But the 3rd form of violence, right, is made its way into the convention because of the Warsaw Ghetto siege policies, right? Putting a population under siege, depriving them of food, of necessities for life, of clean water, and attacking them, right? Which is exactly what Israel has done in Gaza, one of the most densely populated areas in the world, right? So it actually fits exactly this 3rd form of violence in the convention. So if we think about intent to destroy and how it matches actually violence on the ground, as we see from the videos of the officers and the soldiers, right? If we think about the total siege policies, right? There is no doubt, right, that what we're seeing here is genocide. One more thing, I see that there are questions coming in, but one more thing I'll just say about this that is important refers back to my Jewish Currents piece on 13th of October, right? On 13th of October, if you remember, right, this was the first Israeli evacuation order, quote unquote, right? So this, another weaponization here, because this is Israel weaponizing international humanitarian law, that is the responsibility to evict civilians from war zones, right? Why weaponizing, or what, the UN Special Rapporteur for the occupied Palestinian territories, Francesca Albanese, has called this in one of her reports humanitarian camouflage, right? Why? Because we know that the evacuation, this forced removal of people, on 13th of October was when Israel ordered more than 1 million people, Palestinians, from the north to the south of Gaza immediately, right? Happened under conditions of total siege, which followed, by the way, a 16-year siege on Gaza, which is the longest siege in modern history. Gallant actually coined a new term, total siege, right? So it happened already under conditions that the population very much felt the total siege because of the years of siege before that. But it also happened under indiscriminate bombings, right? Designed to be indiscriminate, that is to target everything, right? That is what Israel has done, targets everything in Gaza, right? So people were, and we know that Israel used its most powerful US-made bombs, right? In those days, to target the evacuation route that it designed, right? And evacuation places in the south, right? And we know all this also because Palestinians have been sending text messages and voice messages immediately from the 7th of, which are really a form of testimony, right? And many of them from those days, right, talk about this targeting of people on the evacuation routes and on the evacuation places in the south, right? So to enhance, that's why the weaponization of international humanitarian law, to enhance the violence, right? Not to protect civilians, but to put them more in harm's way, right? And some of these testimonies, and that's how we should really refer to them, right? Actually talk about the fact that the bombings in the south, where Israel designed as safe, right, were so intense that people fled to the south and then decided to flee back to the north because they calculated that they have more chance to survive in the north than in the south in those days, right? So it was very clear, if you were listening to the genocidal rhetoric, if you were looking already at the dynamics of the violence on the ground, right? If you were listening to the total siege proclamation, to the dehumanization, right? And if you were thinking also about the broader history of all of this, Israeli settler colonialism, decades of these attacks, right? And the impunity in which all this happens, it was very, unfortunately and tragically, clear what is happening and what is coming. And that's why I said, and that we are seeing unfolding genocide that has only intensified since.
It's truly a tragedy. It's, you know, those of us who are paying attention to the details and not relying on mainstream media for material and significant omissions. It's truly tragic. And perhaps what's also tragic, although less tragic, is the fact that we get so vilified and punished and attacked, sometimes where it leads to physical threats, or even just having this conversation. And I think that it's important for us to name that, you know, environment that we are at Rutgers University that has been targeted by Congress, that has been targeted by pro-Israeli self-described Zionist groups, and that these types of conversations are what trigger exactly the type of analysis that you began with in this talk, which is this weaponization of anti-Semitism. And I think it's important for all of us to acknowledge that if we allow that to continue, it is a threat to our democracy. It is our threat to the quality of higher education in America. It is a threat to all of us in our ability to think independently, think critically, and allow experts to provide their assessment. And then the audience, whether it's the students, the faculty, or members of the public or the staff, to decide for themselves, right, what conclusions they want to make. But to try to deny people even the opportunity to listen and to analyze is authoritarian. So I want to make sure that, you know, that is stated, because I suspect there will be people after this event that will engage in some bad faith name calling against both of us, the Muslim and the Jew. Now, so we have a lot of wonderful questions that I won't be able to get through all of them, and we won't be, but there's a number of them that are asking the practical question, which is what to do about this. And I understand that, you know, we're all searching for answers, but from your vantage point, and I do think you have a very unique perspective in addition to your expertise, but the fact that you were raised in Israel, correct? And you understand the society, you understand the governments and the various governments that have come and go, although from an outsider's perspective, it seems to keep going, you know, farther to the right over time, over my lifetime. But what do you think that people in the United States, you know, regardless of identity, who want to stop this genocide and prevent it from happening again in the future, what are your suggestions in terms of action items for students, since we are at a university, or action items for members of the community or faculty?
Okay, so
It's a big question, I know.
It's a big question, but it's, you know,
We all have to think.
so there's you know, I do want to refer also, as I said, the weaponization that we're seeing, the weaponization of anti-Semitism is based, it's based, but it's also meant to reproduce basically a world turned upside down, right? As I said, the portrayal of Palestinians as Nazis, right? And the flip side, of course, is that so people under decades of settler colonial occupation, violence, siege, forced displacement, and ongoing Nakba, right, are now portrayed as not just as perpetrators, but as the ultimate perpetrator in modern imagination, Nazis, and a nuclear power, Israel, right, a very powerful state with powerful allies, right, is portrayed, right, not as victims, but as the ultimate victims in modern imagination, right? Jews facing Nazis, right? So this weaponization is meant to throw at us all the time an absurd world turned upside down, a world of lies, right? So I want to say in response to this, right, that one of the things that we need to do is never ever accept this, right? And always insist, right, on documented reality, on truth. But, and this is the thing now, if, we see the weaponization now has reached, again, this is a process that has been ongoing since the 90s. It reached a certain climax in 2016 with the IRA definition of anti-Semitism that really does this, shift from a state to a people. As we know, the IRA definition of anti-Semitism has a very vague definition, but 11 examples, 7 of which are about Zionism in Israel and not about Jews. So embodying this.
Do you want to specify that for people who may not know the reason why IRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Act definition of anti-Semitism is so problematic?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, it's problematic because the example, it have 11 examples attached to the definition itself. The definition is very vague, but it's not the issue, right? The issue is the 11 examples that are considered an integral part of the definition document, right? And 7 of them are about Zionism in Israel, right? And not at all about Jews. The document is also self-contradictory. For example, the document says that any critique of Israel that is similar to critique of other states is not anti-Semitic, right? But one of the examples is that if you say that Israel is a racist endeavor, right, that's anti-Semitism. But we can, I mean, the critique of states is racist, right? The US, Canada, Australia, Germany, France, Italy, like a million states, right? That's fine, right? So the document also, contradicts itself. And of course, the issue of tagging racism specifically, the critique of racism in Israel as anti-Semitic is very important because if we can't talk about racism, then we definitely can't talk about settler colonialism, right? So it's a way of making sure that people don't talk about settler colonialism without even mentioning settler colonialism, right? So this weaponization, which has been going on since the 90s through the framework of Holocaust memory, as I said, tragically, right, now reaches this absurd level, right? And it means that states are the ones driving this weaponization, right? Israel, the US, Germany, other states, right? Recognize that the truth is powerful, right? Research is powerful, right? That's why it's attacked. That's why we see this absurdity thrown in that's why the level of discourse is so absurd that we are told that it's the middle of the day outside, right? Like that, right? What this means, and we know that this attack is people are losing their jobs. Thousands of people are losing their jobs, right? And we know that it's also in the frame of a larger attack against the academic world, for example, right? That the last 13 months is a good opportunity to accelerate it, right? But what that means is that the insistence on documented reality, on research, on truth has to be a collective endeavor, right? It can't be an individual thing, right? It can't be isolated. And I say this and I recognize fully that it is very scary, right? And it has consequences, right? People have lost their jobs. People have been ostracized. There's many consequences, right? But it has to be, all the struggle against this has to be a collective endeavor. So the struggle on truth has to be a collective endeavor, but it's very important to say, again, as you said, what were the consequences of this attack, within the academic world specifically, on documented reality, on research. I mean, there's a library of research on Israel-Palestine and on Israeli state violence, right? The attack against this, right? We can't talk about this, right? We can't talk about what's in the archive, right? The meaning is a larger attack against the academic world. So we're in a significant moment now, right? Where this project, this modern project of the modern university, where we are now, is under unbelievable attack, unprecedented attack, right? Which is another reason that this should be a collective endeavor. So we know we're in universities today now, right? New regulations, right? If you want to protest, register 5 days ahead, only for 2 hours,
Spaces.
right? The truth is permitted for 2 hours, registered 5 days ahead, chalking on the sidewalk. Oh, truth on the sidewalk, God forbid, right? Absolutely not, right? So if 10 people are chalking on the sidewalk, that's easy to shut that down, right? If 1,000 people are chalking on the sidewalk, becomes much more difficult, right? If 1,000 people are saying we will not register 5 days ahead to speak about what we all see in front of our eyes, do we need to register ahead of time to say that it's dark outside? Really? So this is really so insisting on the truth, right? I would say it's the most radical act to do today, right? It's a dangerous act, and it has to be a collective endeavor.
There are a line of questions about the reputation of Israel in the international sphere, the future of Israel politically, internally, and I guess related to what you've stated before in other forums, that this weaponization of anti-Semitism and this defense, full throttle defense of Israel's genocide in Gaza actually makes Jews less safe. So that's another kind of counterintuitive outcome. Could you explain that from your perspective, your expertise? How is this also really dangerous for Jews, regardless of their political position on the Palestine, Israel issues?
Yeah, well, there are a number of things to say about this. First, as I mentioned, we see a shift, right, from thinking about a people under attack by states, right, to protecting a state, right? So this instead, we have to, nation states have been at the root of the persecution of Jews, of targeting Jews, of excluding Jews, right? We can't understand Nazism and the Holocaust, right? As I said, without understanding settler colonialism, the colonial world, and without understanding nationalism and the nation state, right? The weaponization, right, turns this on its head, right? Now we're not thinking about a group, right? And in the struggle against anti-Semitism, we're thinking about a state, right? So that's one thing. Which of course then the flip side of this is, of course, the people who drive this weaponization, right, in some cases are themselves anti-Semites and white supremacists and nationalists, right? And we see this, we see this in the US, we see this in Europe, right? We can think about Viktor Orban in Hungary, in the Hungarian case, which is very paradigmatic, right? Hungary is a member state of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the organization of the IRA, right? So committed to Holocaust memory, committed to a struggle against anti-Semitism in this framework, whereas Viktor Orban, the head of the state, right, is engaged in, is an anti-Semite, actually, right? A very clear anti-Semite. We see this here. You mentioned, the McCarthyist committee, right, on education and the workforce, right? And we have to say McCarthyist, but now it's about a different country, right? McCarthyism was about the US, right? Un-American, right? This is about Israel, right? Which again tells why is this so, right? So the settler colonial context is very important to understand why this connection between the US and Israel. Some of the people on this committee driving this weaponization of anti-Semitism, the aim to silence critique of Israel on US campuses, to intimidate university presidents, faculty, students, anyone, right, who dare criticize Israel in any way, right? Some of them are anti-Semites and white supremacists, right? So again, this kind of absurdity that that we see, that if we are allowing people who are anti-Semites and white supremacists to drive, policies about the struggle against anti-Semitism, of course, in this weaponized framework, then this by necessity will put Jews in danger, right? Because this is the agenda of anti-Semites and white supremacists and nationalists. They are not supporters of Jews wherever they are, right? They are supporters of Jews as long as it's about the Jewish national project, right? From various, I mean, if we think about, the Christian evangelistic perspective, right, then it's particularly terrible, right? But even without that, right? So we're not talking here, again, that's what drives the idea that anti-Zionist Jews are anti-Semites, right? So the idea that you can't be a Jew unless you're a Zionist, unless you're part of the national project, and that's why we see nationalists, right, or anti-Semites, like Viktor Orban in Hungary, like people here in the US, drive this weaponization campaign. This has to put Jews, of course, in danger. This doesn't protect Jews.
And I also want to note, this is something that I have recognized and spoken about in my research on Islamophobia and anti-Arab racism in America, is, from our vantage point, our community's vantage point, one of the consequences of what you're discussing today is, at least appears to be, or the experience is, a privileging of one group over another group within the US context, a privileging of their opinions, a privileging of their political positions, a privileging of often the Zionist position, not the anti-Zionist position within the Jewish American community. But a lot of what we're seeing looks like American racism, but in this very perverse way, where it is Zionist, Jewish, white people who are privileged over Muslim or Christian, Arab, brown people, Palestinian people. And once you start seeing that disparity in dehumanization, humanization versus dehumanization, the recognition of those perspectives, the empathy for their feelings, and the complete opposite, right, for the Muslim, Arab, Palestinian experience. There are a lot of comparisons with how other racial minorities are treated, especially vis-a-vis white communities, when there is a dispute or disagreement about a particular issue or context or series of events. And I know that's a really hard pill to swallow for some, particularly some Jewish Americans whose identity is connected to kind of the historic anti-Semitism. But I think in this period in time, if we look at the facts, and if we look at who's being attacked, which faculty members are being attacked, what are their identities, right? Muslim, Arab, Palestinian, and now we're starting to see even more of the anti-Zionist Jews. Who are the students that are being disciplined? Who are the student groups that are being shut down? And the vast majority tend to be students of color. And then you have the anti-Zionist Jewish students who are being raised as white within kind of this American racialized context, who are, in my opinion, equally courageous as their other their colleagues. But it really, there is a racist dynamic to that in the US. And I think it's important for us to at least appreciate that lens and appreciate that privilege is relative. Right? It's some of us in some contexts have very little privilege, and other contexts have quite a bit of privilege. All of us. Right? So we're depending on race, class, gender, and other identity factors. So I just wanted to make sure that we also recognize that, because I think that's part of the conversation about anti-Semitism from the Muslim, Arab, Palestinian perspectives.
Yeah, I think that it's, just to say something about this, I think it's, anti-Semitism is a modern phenomena, again, tied to colonialism and the nation state, of course, has been entangled, like it emerged, right, with ideas and exclusion and violence against other groups, right? I mentioned, for example, Arab-speaking Jews under French and French and Italian rule in North Africa, right? So we can think about the entanglements, and there's, again, terrific research on the entanglements of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in these kinds of contexts, for example, right? Or we can think about the exclusion of Jews in European nation states, right, before and of course during World War II and the Holocaust, and Roma, right? Of course, if we think about Roma in general, the project of Holocaust memory, right, has not worked out very well, right? Roma continue to be marginalized, excluded, discriminated, attacked in European states, committed allegedly to Holocaust memory, right? So these entanglements of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, anti-Roma racism, right, are in the history of the emergence of anti-Semitism as a modern phenomena, which also point to the importance of collaborations, right, and solidarity in the struggle against anti-Semitism. And one of the things that this weaponized discourse, of course, does, right, is it makes solidarity more difficult, right, or even impossible, right? Because again, we're not talking now about Jews as Jews, we're talking now about Jews in relation to the national project Israel, right? So by definition, then it removes them from networks of solidarity, right? That are very, very important, I think, in struggles against, racism in general, the way that anti-Semitism and Islamophobia or anti-Roma racism against are entangled one with each other, right? So this, of course, the state weaponization here also functions strategically in order to make the struggle, right, against state violence right here and in other places more difficult. And of course, this indeed has a white supremacist framework, because again, looking at Jews as Zionists is a white supremacist framework. Only in the Israeli context, it manifests itself as Jewish supremacy, right? Of course, this is very much tied to U.S. to white supremacy, and white supremacy in the U.S. is can't really understand U.S. politics, society, and history without white supremacy.
Right. Well, thank you so much for your generous time and your expertise. You've given us so much to think about. Many of us agree, some of us don't agree. The objective of this conversation was certainly not to indoctrinate anyone or persuade them even to necessarily agree, but to get them to think and to expose them to a set of ideas and analysis that is based on Dr. Segal's deep expertise. Again, we're so fortunate to have you take time out of your very busy schedule to educate us here at Rutgers. And we're grateful for the online and in-person audience. And before we officially close out the event, I would just encourage everyone who found this event to be beneficial to support the Center for Security, Race, and Rights. We are under intense attack. There are hundreds and thousands, and I would say 10,000s of people who really do not want us to be able to have these types of events in the United States of America, which I find to be quite un-American and anti-democratic and authoritarian. But we need your help to allow us to continue to be part of the democratic process and allow students and faculty and staff and members of the public to decide for themselves, right, whether they want to participate, whether they want to listen, and what conclusions they want to make for themselves. Rethinking society. So please go to csrr.rutgers.edu. Please make a donation, generously ideally, but whatever amount you can make, press the donate button. We have an excellent podcast called the Race and Rights Podcast. that I encourage you to follow. And if you are on social media, you can find us at Rutgers CSRR or RUCSRR. And we have multiple panels coming up in the future. You can find that under our events webpage at csrr.rutgers.edu. But again, Dr. Segal, thank you so much for coming. This was truly enlightening, inspiring, and motivating. I hope that all of us will take one takeaway from this is to continue to work together in collectivities with courage and integrity. So thank you.